This episode of the Zealous Podcast is sponsored by Perform Better. Perform Better is the leader in functional training by supplying innovative products and top-notch education to trainers, coaches, and therapists. Check out the brand new Perform Better app, designed for professionals who want to stay on top of their game. This free app features education from the world's best. You'll learn from industry leaders including Mike Boyle, Gray Cook, Sue Falzoni, Charlie Weingroff, and many more. Topics range from strength and conditioning, program design, nutrition, business, and marketing. Just go to performbetter.com. Welcome back to another week of Zealous Podcast. I'm Rocky Snyder, and with me this week, it's all about Major League Soccer and bringing individual athletes up into the ranks there. So I've got Brandon Moran. He is in charge of player development for the Seattle Sounders. That's Major League Soccer, folks, in case you're just kind of slow to the game here, because, I have been a soccer coach myself for a number of years. I think for the last 10 years with U.S. Soccer, of course, the little ones growing up, and now they're beyond me. They're getting to be into Brandon's realm. So, Brandon, welcome on to the Zealous Podcast.
Thank you, Rocky. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I'm only like licensed D level at best for soccer coaching, and then all the basics, the fundamentals that's all I can handle. What you're doing though with your athletes is pretty remarkable. So tell me a little bit about your title with the Seattle Sounders, what it encompasses, and we'll start from there.
Sure. Well, my title is Head of Developmental Performance, and my role is it really encompasses the overall development, long-term athlete development of our U15s up through the first team. So that would include the U17s and our professional second team who compete in the USL. And then we, of course, bridge the gap between the USL and the MLS. And my role is to oversee the physical and mental development of those players.
Wow, that's a mouthful beyond just being a strength coach, which for you and I both, that's kind of where we come from, is the strength conditioning world. So maybe a little bit of background with your strength conditioning and what brought you to the Sounders.
Yeah, well, like most of us, I started in sports. I was a soccer guy. I grew up playing the sport, track and field. I was a big track and field guy as well, and it kind of led into being in the gym a lot, doing a lot of strength and conditioning myself, and from there that led into being interested from an academic perspective in exercise science, exercise physiology, kinesiology, sports nutrition, all of those more formal academic topics, and then from I just continued working as a S&C coach for years. I got heavily involved in NSCA, and I was fortunate enough to kind of be involved with Boyd Epley and his Fly Solo program when he started it, and that kind of brought me even deeper into the mix, I think. And and I was just fortunate enough to be a sports coach in soccer, and really tie those things together, tie the S&C together with the actual tactical development players. And one thing led to another over time. I worked with the women's youth national team for a couple of years, and I worked with USL, a couple lower level USL teams, and that led to my opportunity in 2014 with Seattle.
Wow. Where did you go to school?
University of Arizona.
All
so
right.
My undergrad was there, and then I was able to do some work with Dr. White in kinesiology, and a few other and I did some work on the side with track and field athletes, with soccer athletes, and with some of the football players, and that's kind of where I started. Yeah.
So in regards to like long-term athletic development, LTAD, as we know it in our field, what is the most successful recipe that you have found to prevent athletes from burning out, starting at such a young age? Because these days, I mean, we are connected to FIFA now. U.S. Soccer has pretty much become as homogenous as far as I'm learning as they could be along the guidelines of FIFA, which is the world's organization for overseeing soccer as we know it. But
Yep.
in terms of like youth soccer, bringing kids up, we've got fall soccer, winter soccer, spring soccer. We got here in Santa Cruz, we've got summer beach soccer. I mean, you could easily have a single sport athlete at the age of 6 if you're not careful. But what's your secret sauce for having such success with LTAD?
Well, for me, it really starts with the player and their motivation and passion for the game. And it's if they have to be willing to put in the time and the effort to get to those higher levels, and that's really where it starts. It starts with the willingness of the player and the passion the player has for the game. And the question actually becomes, and I think the question you're asking is, when do you start to specialize in a sport versus try and give that player an opportunity or that athlete an opportunity to play other sports, right?
Yeah.
And what we often term as donor sports in soccer, where can we expose these athletes to other activities that may help improve their ability to be a better soccer player? Or track and field, for example, is a great example of that, right? Improve acceleration, help them learn proper mechanics of sprinting, how to decelerate, sprint, plyometric training. That all kind of comes into track and field, and then of course maybe swimming to improve overall aerobic capacity. These are just basic examples of maybe a donor sport that could help with improving the player's overall athletic ability as a soccer player.
And do you encourage those specific sports, or is it really based on the individual and their passions and desires? I mean, would you encourage other sports, or are those the main kind of donor sports you think of?
No, honestly, before they enter our system, which at the moment is a U15, starts at U15. Yeah, I would really leave it up to the child, and I'd leave it up to the parents, of course, to make those decisions. I think any sport, I mean, karate, taekwondo. I mean, there's you can there's all types of sports that help improve coordination, hand-eye coordination, hand-foot coordination. Just and the synchronization of movement and helping players understand how to balance and move. And I'm pretty open to that, and I know parents and kids have the kind of have the free reign there. Once you get into U15 and then you get into our environment, it becomes a little different, because the commitment is a bit higher. I mean, they're training so much, and it would be really hard for them to be a part of another sport.
Yeah, I imagine, because I can't see there being too much time outside of skill development, athletic development, and so on, unless it's part of your curriculum, your programming, right? So you may just choose to have a fun day with the kids and do ultimate frisbee, right?
Absolutely.
Or something of that nature, where they're doing multi-directional movements. They've got sprinting, they've got eye-hand coordination, they've got placement of the field, they've got a whole bunch of carryover into soccer. So are you part of the recruitment process, or do they get recruited and then you meet them? What's that process like?
Yeah, well, we have a director of recruiting, and so that the coaching staff, head coaches, assistant coaches, technical directors, general manager, they're all involved in that process of recruiting players. I am introduced to the player once they're part of our structure, once they're part of our system.
Gotcha. And so then therefore you meet them, and you need to do a needs analysis. You need to do some assessing. What are the things that you're using for assessing an athlete?
It really kind of depends on when they come into our system, whether or not they come in as a U15 or a second team pro, or even coming into the first team. It may be a little bit different. With our younger age groups, 17s and our 15s, I think it's essential that we kind of evaluate them on their fundamental strength and movement qualities. So we'll use things like a hex bar deadlift to assess their strength, how much ground force they can generate, and we'll use maybe FMS to evaluate their functional movement. And then we have basic field tests that we will use to assess their ability to accelerate and decelerate and stabilize and those sort of things. And we're fortunate enough to have devices like GymAware and GPS, and we have bilateral force plate and NordBord. So we have these technologies, but honestly, at the team level, most of our evaluations come from just field assessments.
Okay. Yeah, that's for the older athletes, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I am using, I shouldn't say I said we, because I have a group of a whole team of me, so to speak, but we're using GymAware to assess jump height and looking at load velocity measures and differences in, we're also using it for like assessing fatigue and those sort of things. So the youngsters do get a chance to use that technology, and they also have GPS units. So we're assessing, how much acceleration, deceleration they're getting in, what their high-speed running looks like, their total distance, and what the density of that the quality of that distance looks like, and those sort of things. So.
I'm just curious too, from like a numbers perspective. You got all these potential recruits coming in, developing these players. How many of those will actually see time on an MLS pitch?
Well, we, over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, have been pretty successful at getting players up to the first team and getting them exposed to that environment. But honestly, Rocky, we have, now, 60 kids in our academy, and, we may end up with 4 or 5 in preseason at a time, maybe a few more, depending on, the year and what that particular age group looks like.
And these kids is it regional, like they're in the Seattle area, Seattle proper, or do you have them spread out across the nation and you're giving them programs and kind of keeping an eye on them in that regard?
No, they're all with us. They're all within Seattle. They all train at the same location.
Okay. Does that mean that the majority of kids are from the Pacific Northwest, or are you recruiting kids from all over and they have to live now in Seattle?
A little bit of both. Yep.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we have kids from all over the country, and we have a bunch that are from the local area. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so 15, we're getting into the fundamentals of proper lifting. I mean, you and I both with the NSCA, and it's amazing that you've had such time with Boyd. But many years ago, I think it was in the mid to late 90s, the NSCA put out a position statement on pre-adolescent strength training and so on. And it's been kind of modified since then, but in the essence is that at this stage between adolescent or pre-adolescent, this is the time that we really need to train proper mechanics in lifting. And it's not so much about how much could they lift, but proper positioning and movement. So I imagine that part of this long-term athletic development with the U15, U16, and so on, that's your primary goal when it comes to the weight room. Is that right?
That's right. There's a lot of band work, of course. There's a lot of kind of speed, agility, quickness, focus, and what we try and do at the younger ages is introduce them to form techniques and sprinting, like basic things, wall drills, A skips, B skips, those sort of things, change of direction skill, how to lower your center of gravity, reduce impulse. All of those basic ideas come in into play with the U15s, and there's not a whole lot of actual core weightlifting going on. You know, we want to start to expose them to some light loading, but the focus is on ball mastery, technical skill, and body awareness.
All right, and you mentioned, of course, coordination and accuracy. They've got balance, which brings us into kind of the neurological component. So, do you do anything with motor neurology? I mean, do you assessing these components? Do you ever do any kind of drills that are exciting those areas of the brain to enhance their accuracy or their balance or coordination?
Well, we do most. You know, it's a great question. You know, I think where we're going with that is how we introduce the ball to the individual, and how that, and then also how we build in the coordination and the synchronization of the movements to be balanced with the ball. Everything is around the ball. Everything is based on how they manipulate the ball and how well they do that. You know, and that seems to be, you know, a pretty good system for us. It seems to be pretty effective, and we have to remember, you know, as an S&C and a sports scientist, we only have a limited amount of time with players, so we have to share that time with the sports coach. We have to share that time with, obviously, their schooling and things, their time outside of soccer, and we have to be extremely sensitive to all of those things. So when we do have them, we want to make sure we maximize that time. And the way we do that is to make sure the ball is involved in as much as possible from a fundamental standpoint. Yeah.
So when it comes to like a guideline to other coaches in similar situations, or youth soccer, high school sport coach in regards to soccer, what do you think is an ideal amount of time? Like, I'm sure if you had more time, you could do more things with the athlete, but with where you are right now, what do you think is, like, are we talking 30 minutes, 45? Do you have an hour and a half? What is it with the younger athletes, at least right now?
Yeah, well, we try and microdose things in. So in the warm up, which takes, you know, before training, if we can get a hold of a handful of guys, you know, once they start showing up, we immediately start with them, and that gives us some one-on-one, two-on-one, three-on-one time. You know, as they start to trickle in, we'll start to grab them, and we'll focus on basic running mechanics. Or we'll get the sleds out and have them do some marching with the sleds, just to kind of prime them and help them understand, you know, knee drive and where what their body shape should look like when they're accelerating, you know. And then once the entire group is together and we start the warm up, we will have usually 15-20 minutes with the players, and in that time we will, you know, introduce the entire group then to a general warm up. In that general warm up, we'll reinforce, you know, proper movement mechanics, change of direction, and then we will move from there into more of a specific warm up where the ball's involved, and there's a, you know, the actions are a bit quicker, change of direction is a bit more intense, maybe some passing patterns within that, and that typically leads into then, you know, what the coaches, the sports coach has in mind for them for that particular day. And that's usually and that's usually our general methodology. I think, you know, we will try and expose players on our match day -4 and our match day -3 to specific loading, and we'll try and get a little extra in, at least in the senior group. What senior group meaning the USL group, the second team. They will always do, I say always, but it's not always. I think as often as possible on a match day -4 and a match day -3, we will have what we call a PM session. And in that PM session, there's a specific focus for that day from a strength perspective, or from a speed endurance or speed strength perspective, depending on the day.
Gotcha. Okay. You just
gave me a
That's a
whole
lot.
bunch of potential questions to ask. The first one, though, is how do you infuse novel movements and create novelty within regards to the warm-up? Like, I see this constantly on the pitch where a team gets out there and almost by rote, they just know the same movements, that they get almost complacent, that the routine of warming up hasn't changed from the first week of the season till the last week of their season. Granted, the kids know what they're doing, or the teenagers, whatever athletes we're talking about, but I find personally that if you're not changing something every week or every few weeks, then their bodies are not actually going to be asked to develop to a greater degree. So how often do you mix up the warm-ups?
Yeah, well, that's kind of where the art of it is. You know, I think with experience, you're able to learn how to re-engage the athlete, and that's the key to it, is to make it enjoyable for them, and to be creative, but to be creative within your own circle of influence or your circle of competency, and make sure that you're not, being too creative. And I think that's kind of where the experience comes into play. You always want your warm-ups to, in some way, engage the player into the topic of the session. So identifying what the topic is, what the coach is trying to get out of the session, I think is an important starting point, because once you do that, it helps you become a bit more creative in how you go about preparing them mentally for that topic. And honestly, I think experience plays a role in that.
Sure. So does the coach come to you with, this month's menu, so to speak? Here's the topics that I'm going to be laying out over the course of the season, over the course of the next few weeks, and I need your warm ups, your strength conditioning to match that. Is that how that works, or how?
Well,
does it go up?
yeah, it's extremely collaborative. We meet every day. We meet sometimes twice a day. Well, most of the time, twice a day. There's a lot of logistics involved in the process. Planning is probably what takes most of our time as coaches. So we'll sit in a round table, literally in a table that's round or square, where we're facing each other, and we will discuss first, usually I'll just kind of take you through a timeline, I guess. We start maybe on a Monday. We will meet at 8:00 in the morning, and we will go through that particular week in terms of what we're trying to achieve for that week. And that's all based on the match and when we actually play. We'll have specific topics in mind that we have to get through for that week. And then once we have a general idea of what that week looks like, we'll start to isolate the days. So we'll look at what we're doing today versus, Monday, Wednesday, whatever it is. And what helps is we're pretty consistent in how we approach that. So we know what we need to get out of a match day -4 versus a match day -3.
Gotcha.
And as we get closer into the week, or closer to the game, further into the week, so you're talking maybe a match day -2 or 1, it's pretty clear that the focus is going to be on individual functional defending, for example, or tactical focus around functional movements of the team on the field. And I think that consistency helps from a planning perspective on my end.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it makes complete sense. And that way there's fewer question marks and fewer gaps in between. Now,
Exactly.
when you mentioned loading, you start to load the athletes. I watched a couple of videos on YouTube that you had put out 5 months ago, and there was a few that were very obviously gate oriented, split jumps with opposing arm drives, that type of action. Are those the loading patterns we're talking about, or what are your go-to kind of loading movements?
Yeah. Things that are very specific and, again, specificity in training, right? So things that look not just look like the movement, but are the movement from a force production standpoint is really important for me. And yeah, I think a lot of sled pulls, a lot of split squat jumps at the younger ages, so they're using their body weight as load. You know, and then as we get up into the older age groups, and guys can handle a lot more load because their training history is much greater, then we may introduce similar movements, but maybe there'll be a hex bar deadlift involved, or maybe there'll be a barbell involved, so there's a bit more load on them. Yeah, but to go back to your question and your original point, I think for me it's about specificity in movement and trying to use that specificity to prepare that athlete for what they have to deal with on the field.
I'm really glad you bring that up, because I think when strength coaches that are kind of new to the industry think of sport specific, they look at the movements in a particular sport and then they try to match it up with a traditional lift or gym movement. I prefer not using the word exercise, but like some motion in a gym that is traditional, when in fact that's in my way of thinking, sport specificity is actually finding the positions that, say, a soccer player will do out on the pitch, and can I place them in one of those positions, and then can I load in 3 different dimensions of space, or the 3 planes of motion. So let's say they're doing a cut. Okay, can I get them to get into that cut position, and then can I get their hips and the pelvis to move forward and backwards laterally and rotationally, or can I get their torso to do that? So we're feeding this kind of information through the neuromuscular system as to what each joint has to do in order to support that position. So I imagine that's also what you're talking about.
Yeah, dynamics of effort, right? So it's also the coordination of the movement and the synchronization of the movement from a joint perspective, and I think that all has to be considered when you're designing a program for any age group, from the younger age groups all the way up through to the seniors. And obviously with the younger age groups, the amount of force that they can produce and handle is not the same, and you have to take that into account. But the movements that players are actually performing on the field aren't that different. What's different is the impulse that they're dealing with, right? How they accelerate and then have to absorb that momentum to decelerate and change direction. So are you preparing them? Is your programming preparing them for those things? That's the question.
That's awesome. I'm really glad you bring up acceleration and deceleration, because the majority of time when we're thinking about strength conditioning, it's all about acceleration, right? It's all about explosiveness. It's all about how much force can we produce off the ground and so on. But in only recently, it seems in the last 10 years, are we really talking about deceleration more and more, when in fact that's where the majority of injuries are going to occur, and yet we're kind of just a little bit slow on the uptake with that. So in terms of training deceleration, what do you do with your athletes to help that? Aside from obviously sprint mechanics and slowing down and changing of direction and so on, what other elements are you doing to help enhance their ability to handle deceleration?
For us, it's Adam Owen, who's my boss and the high performance director for Sounders. We have this conversation about robustness and how to build that into players. I think often we spend so much time focused on injury prevention, and that leads to being afraid of actually loading up an athlete and exposing them to stress. And for us, it's the exposure of those accelerations and those decelerations correctly, and giving them the opportunity to deal with those loads, but at the same time making sure that they're recovering from those things is key for us, right? So what we try and do is time it right, and usually our match day -4 is far enough from a match to allow us to really expose players to a lot more acceleration and decelerations, and we do that through on-field activities. So small-sided games, a lot of rondos, those sort of environments help to bring out a lot more acceleration and decelerations. And obviously it's a balance, because in order to have high decels, you have to have high accels, right? They kind of go together. You have to generate the momentum in order to be able to deal with that momentum and decel and control it eccentrically to move and change directions. So that balance is always the challenge, trying to get that. But what we've found is, if we can minimize the total distance that players cover on those match day -4s, and we can minimize the high speed running, and what we consider high speed running is 5 meters a second or greater, and instead focus on an activity or a group of activities that expose players to a lot more accelerations and decelerations without exposing them to a lot of total distance and total high speed running. We're able to get that out of them and prepare them to handle those loads. That's what we do. And then of course on our match day -3, it's different. We focus less on the accelerations and the decelerations, and we focus more on exposing them to more extensive environment. So it becomes bigger field spaces, more high speed running, more total distance, so on and so forth. And that's how we periodize our training.
So it's interesting, because really acceleration, deceleration, we're talking gait mechanics, and I'm a huge proponent of understanding gait mechanics, because if you have improper mechanics, then you're going to have an efficient runner, or they're going to be figuring out another way to gain the speed in a compensatory fashion. So you mentioned assessments such as FMS and others, but do you do gait analysis, gait assessment to better allow acceleration, deceleration to occur?
We don't. We have, I mean, I use Dartfish and those sort of video analysis software for individuals, and I will assess individual gait analysis, but just from a timing perspective, it's really hard to get all of these players, evaluated and assessed. And most of the time, it's what we're looking at doing is getting them into small groups, so it's manageable, and then taking them through specific drills. For example, like an individual functional defending drill, which exposes them again to they have to accelerate to get out and close down the ball, but then they have to decelerate and be under control to affect the ball. So we'll work on those sort of movements within the training environment, more so than, let's say, doing a gait analysis on by having them run, or a gait analysis by putting them on a treadmill and then trying to figure out, how to better improve their ability to accelerate or decelerate. In a more controlled environment, when you're able to take an individual athlete and video them, and then assess how they accelerate out their what we call their entry speed into the acceleration, and their body angles and their foot placement, and then how they slow themselves down when they start to decelerate. It would be great if we were able to do that, but that's something that we have to probably introduce during a off season or during a preseason.
Yeah.
In the in season, what we have to do is focus on what we can change or what we can manage while the player's on the field.
Certainly, I can see that also being utilized for a return to sport. So you've got a chronic hamstring injury, or somebody's with an Achilles or inversion sprain or whatever, they're coming back on into sport, and then you may want to use that to really fully assess what the level of rehabilitation truly is. So when it does come to injury, though, and we're talking like for the younger crowd, of course, it's obviously something you want to keep injury as low as a probability as you can. So with that said, I want to talk about the $1 million players, the guys that are they're not it's that their level of importance is any higher than the younger recruits coming up, but we're talking like the Sounders themselves, all the starters there. What are you doing to help reduce the likelihood of injury occurring? There's the chance is always there, but what specific things in regards to strength conditioning, player development do you do to help keep those numbers down?
Yeah, I mean, you're referring to non-contact injuries, muscle injuries.
Correct. Yeah,
those sort of things. Yeah. There's a lot of at that level. There's a lot of assessment that's taking place. There's a lot of individual evaluations. That's when we're using bilateral force plates to evaluate changes in jump height versus ground contact time. So the RSI index, reactive strength index, for example, looking at something like that, or using the Nord board to see changes in eccentric loading of the hamstring, when you do eccentrics there, or the growing bar to assess changes in the growing squeeze. Those assessments are extremely critical to the process of looking at where the athlete is from a fitness and readiness perspective. And then you really can't discount the qualitative assessments as well. So the general wellness reporting of the athlete and how they report their RPEs and those sort of things are also important. And there's other factors, there's other variables that have to be considered: the rotation of the squad, the age of the athlete, the age of the player. Those things are considered as well.
So what are some red flags just off the top of your head that might come up like that year, just, or even orange flags that are like indications that, okay, we need to pay attention to this? Are there some common ones within the sport of soccer? Let's say that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing that I value the most is the conversations that we have with the athletes themselves and how they respond to those conversations. And again, the qualitative side of what we do, I think sometimes is overlooked because we're so fixated on numbers and those sort of things. But there's a lot of good information you can get just from connecting with the athlete and talking with them and saying, how are you feeling? Or, what's your soreness level? Those sort of conversations happen. And then from a objective perspective, if there's dramatic changes in their soreness profile or their fatigue state, if, for example, you're having them do a counter movement jump and their jumping strategy is completely changed because their knees are sore and their ankles are sore and their jump height is obviously going to be affected. I mean, those things are obvious, right? You can really kind of pinpoint those pretty quickly. Not to say that that's going to, you may just be a little bit more protective of that athlete in those situations. And I think that's important. That's an important starting point. Yeah.
And when it comes to like a wish list for yourself, say it's Christmas Eve and the big guy's about to come down the chimney, what is it that you would ask him in regards to your job? Is there something that you would really like to have, whether it's invented or not, or what is it that you feel like could just push this team to the top in regards to like strength conditioning?
That's a big one. We are fortunate enough to have just about everything that we need from a just technology perspective. Almost too much, I think, at times. The old.
I hear that a lot.
And you can't discount the importance of having good staff and good people around you. And if I could just, continue to grow a team of staff that are collaborative and are, you know, that really for me is the big one, is just the people that you work with. And I think people make the biggest difference over any technology that you can buy or purchase, and good people are, as they say, hard to find. And if I could have anything I wanted, it would be that. It would be just a great, great group of people to help collaborate and take care of the athletes.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think pretty much last question here. We're emerging out of COVID. There's more fans that are coming into the stadiums these days. It's really nice to hear the crowd and not have a silent game out there on the pitch.
Yeah.
As we emerge out of COVID, are there things that are going to change within your job as charge of player development? I mean, is there, or are you pretty much doing exactly what you need to do regardless if the restrictions lift or not?
Yeah, not much has changed. I think we've done a great job there. Our medical staff is unbelievable, and they're really leading the way with it. We just do what they tell us to do, and they've been able to give us what we need from just an autonomy perspective and the freedom to do our jobs without but doing that within a environment that's safe for us and safe for the athletes. So not much will really change as we move forward. I mean, the one thing that is interesting to me is whether or not we continue to have players wear the masks when they travel, even after, let's say, after COVID is completely done and it's in our rearview mirror. And there's an argument to say that maybe having them just continue wearing the mask, especially when they're on a plane, is not a bad idea. And that's something that I will bring up to the medical staff, and we'll have that discussion.
That's really interesting, because we were just talking about that, about how few people have gotten colds or flus this year. I mean, the numbers drop because everyone's washing their hands appropriately and wearing masks. So that makes complete sense. I mean, how many players are usually having colds or their ability on the pitch has been really affected because they've got something. So they've caught something. So yeah, that will be interesting. I'd be curious to find out what you guys actually decide once that happens. Well, this has been great, Brandon. I can't thank you enough. And I hope, do you travel with the team when you guys come down and play the Quakes?
I'll be with the second team. So I'll be with the Tacoma Defiance, and so no to your
All right. I was going to say, the next time you find yourself in San Jose when the Sounders come down and play the Quakes, then we'll try and connect. But I hope our paths do connect in the near future, and the cloud of COVID lifts, and we'll be able to go to NSCA conferences and whatnot once again. So I gotta say thanks. I'll put your LinkedIn information in the description below, as well as the Seattle Sounders website. So if they want to learn more about your organization, that would be great. But thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Rocky. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's been fun. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's it for another episode of the Zealous Podcast. I want to thank Brandon Moran for coming on and sharing all that he's been doing with Seattle Sounders and their development team, as well as MLS. And be sure to tune in next week when we have another fantastic guest talking about athletic training and sports conditioning and everything related to being behind the scenes and supporting the pros behind the pros. Be sure to subscribe to Zealous Podcast wherever you're listening, and we'll see you next week.